Hey everybody, thanks for coming today. It's really good to be back on the UCA campus. So just a few short years ago, I was in classes over there, so I'm really happy to be back on campus today. Just curious, how many students, how many industry, how many different people? So if you're a student, raise your hand. If you're industry, raise your hand. All right, and then professors and others. Okay, awesome. Well, I did want to start off by talking about power technology. The Conductor invited us to speak about our story as entrepreneurs, our story as innovators, our story as a startup. And that's really how we look at ourselves. We're a 50-year-old startup. Despite what you may think, a 50-year-old company doesn't have all the answers. So we have a lot of issues, just like a startup does. We just had a little more time to solve those. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. So I thought I'd start with our origin story and tell you a little story about how we got started. So how did a laser company get started in, of all places, Little Rock, Arkansas? So it's a little bit of a weird story, so that's what we really wanted to start with today. So it all started with one man, our founder, Mr. Burgess, who looks a little bit like me and William, but might be related, might not. But really wanted to start by talking about him, because it was him and a few other people that we could credit with our founding and our starting. So it all started on the founder's kitchen table in 1969. And that was about 50-something years ago. And it quickly moved into the founder's garage. And it took a little bit of luck and a little bit of entrepreneurial spirit to start power technology. Mr. Burgess had a friend who went to a company in Jacksonville, and at that time the company was called Blunt and George, and they made lasers for laying sewer pipe. And it was one of the first commercial applications to use lasers, and we just happened to have a couple of guys in Jacksonville that were involved in that kind of business. And in fact, they filed a patent for it and got one of the early laser application patents for it. So that was pretty cool. So one of Tom's friends went to Blunt George looking for a job and discovered that Blunt George had a problem and they didn't know how to solve it. So when the friend got back from the interview, he looked over at Tom and said, "Hey, they've got a problem. It has to do with electronics. Why don't you go talk to them about it?" And so Tom, being an entrepreneur and just friendly guy, always looking for a challenge to solve, he went to Jacksonville. And it turns out that they had a laser, and it was comprised of 3 parts. And one of the parts, the electronics part, really had some lifetime issues and some quality issues, and it couldn't last very long in the field. And so the laser system was a laser tube, of which I brought one to show you. If I can get it out. So one of the 3 parts was a laser tube, just like this one. As a matter of fact, this one's about 50 years old. The second part was a power supply, a package of electronics. And the third part was a battery from 1960s car batteries. So they were a lot larger back then than the battery you have now. And so the person laying the sewer pipe would have to manage 3 of these very large components. So Mr. Burgess took the back off of the laser and went out and made a metal cap with a local machine shop. And he had that made and turned to his design. So how many of you have heard about MVPs, or minimally viable product? Well, that term didn't exist 50 years ago, but that's exactly what Tom was doing, was making a minimally viable product. And so he took the back cap off the laser and made this teacup size enclosure. He then, on his kitchen table, built an electronics power supply into the inside of this cup, and ultimately took it back to Blunt and George. So Blunt and George looked at it very skeptically and said, "This is a lot smaller than we're used to, and we're very, very skeptical of what you've done." So sometimes innovation doesn't look practical. And so they're like, well, we'll call you back in 6 weeks, and we're not sure about this, and they hem and hawed a little bit. But ultimately, they called back in just 2 weeks and said that they wanted to place their largest order ever. And that turned out to be for 6 pieces. Now, Mr. Burgess didn't even have a company at that point. All he did was something on his kitchen table just to see if he could be a friendly neighbor and help out a company in Jacksonville. So that was interesting in that, they placed an order before he even had a company. So that was sort of the innovation side of where he got started. They continued to purchase for about 8 to 10 years. And it's interesting now that Tom had a company, actually had to order, he now needed to have the company. So like several other technology companies in that era, they were looking for the absolute cheapest place that they could start a business. They didn't have a Makerspace, and they didn't have cheap rent. So where did technology companies all get their start back in the 50s and 60s? Anybody want to guess? In their garage. So what it turns out is that companies like Apple and Amazon and Google all had this trend of starting in their garage. So power technology was very similar in that it started in a garage in the lower right-hand corner. There used to be a garage door there where that window's at. So that was the garage that power technology started in. And there's several other trends that we've noticed over the years of these technology companies that started in that era. So it's just pretty interesting overall that they all started in garages. So let's talk a little bit about innovation in the development of new products and how laser technology has changed and how power technology is innovated. Because that's really what entrepreneurship is about innovating, creating something new that didn't exist before. So, the first product was these high voltage power supplies. By the way, they're high voltage power supplies. They generate 10 or 15,000 volts. So they're a little bit of a unique electronics package. And, it started out with a high voltage power supply, and that's used to make the gases in the laser tubes vibrate. And when they vibrate, they emit light. And so that's how you get laser beams back 50 years ago, is you had this high voltage power supply and a glass tube full of gas. So that's really the origin of the technology that we started with, was a gas-based laser system. And so we made those gas-based laser systems for quite a number of years until a new threat came in the form of a new type of laser. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But just to give you an idea of how things evolved from the first order of 6 pieces, it wasn't but about 10 or 15 years later that power technology was running 2 shifts to supply the demand from IBM Corporation. And IBM was one of the first companies that had barcode scanners in supermarkets. And so in the late 80s, I think it was, early 80s, IBM was one of our largest customers, and they were doing so many pieces that it required us to have 2 shifts of production just to keep up with their global demand. And so we had a laser power supply in almost every supermarket scanner in the world. Of course, back then we didn't have Walmart with its billion locations, but anyway, that was pretty interesting to see that it moved from 6 pieces all the way up to thousands and thousands of units for barcode scanners. So, that new laser technology was starting to come along, and it was called semiconductor lasers. And really at that point, there had to be a decision about whether or not you would innovate or just stay stagnant. And so at the time, they decided that, it's time to innovate. We decided to adopt this new technology and replace our existing product with a new product. At least that's what we thought. We thought this new product is going to replace all of the old gas lasers. Well, it turns out that we're still making the gas lasers 52 years later. We're still manufacturing those. And the semiconductor laser continues to be really the bulk of our business right now. So that makes two different types of lasers that we've had to innovate through. And we're going to talk about a third type in a little bit as well. So the biggest part of our business now is the semiconductor lasers, and I brought a few samples there in the front you guys are welcome to look at. But you can tell they're much, much smaller. We go from something that's very large and long to something the size of your pinky. Really the same intensity and the same brightness and even the same colors. So pretty stark contrast that over time things like technology get smaller and smaller. So innovation was a necessity. What was really an advantage for us when this new technology came along was that we already had a customer base that was buying lasers from us. And so once they started using lasers, they wanted to use more and more lasers. And so they were really good at getting multiple products out of this one technology. So they migrated very easily from the older technology to the newer technology. So that was a real blessing for us in that we were able to migrate the customers from one technology to the next. So it's also a good example of incremental growth. I know some of you are entrepreneur students, and this is a good idea or a good example of an adjacent market or incremental growth. And so there's a lot of talk about venture capital, about gazelles, about blue ocean strategies. And those are all great things, but there's nothing wrong with growing a company based on incremental growth as well. So don't let that scare you if that comes into your world. You know, incremental growth is good growth as well. So there was a third type of laser that came along in, I don't know, in the 90s, I think, and that was a crystal-based laser, and that's the third type of laser that we've gotten involved with. So this is three different laser technologies. They all have their unique abilities and their unique reasons to be in the market. One thing is clear with consumers. If they can find a technology that does the job cheaper, they'll use it. So if there's a new laser technology that comes out that's $5 cheaper or $10 cheaper, you know, they're going to migrate to it because their application will be successful either way. They don't care what type of technology they use. They just want a solution. And so, you know, the cheaper solution always wins out when it comes down to it. So, you know, adding those crystal-based lasers really helped us fill in some gaps in our product line. So we're happy to see that. So I thought I'd share some other stories about innovation that's happened in power technology, just to give you some idea of what else is possible with lasers. So one of our more interesting entrepreneurial endeavors was to replace the bulbs in movie projectors with laser light. So how many people have been to the cinema lately? Yeah, well you two are the exception. Everybody else quit going to the cinema. And so that's really affected the sales of cinema equipment. There's no cash flow, means there's no money to invest in new technologies. So one of the things that we developed was this system to use lasers to provide the light that a cinema projector needs. And this was a really fun project that we worked on. And what it allows us to do is to use 50% less electricity to project the image on the screen. So the cost savings just in the electricity alone was tremendous. On top of that, you got a better picture quality, better image quality at the same time. So the person sitting in the seat really liked the more immersive environment, the more colorful photos or video on the screen. So it was really a win-win for both the consumer and the venue operator. And so this is something that you'll see in your local theaters probably pretty soon, if not already. So if you've been to the cinema at Colonel Glenn Road, the big Rave 10 there, Laser projectors are already present in that location. So I'm not sure what you guys have here in Conway, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're not laser-based projectors as well. So this was really interesting for us because it allowed us to use a lot of small lasers to make a really big light inside the projector. And it became so much more efficient than the bulbs that they were using, because a light bulb, it radiates 360 degrees, but a laser is very directional. And so the light bulb doesn't always shine toward the screen, but you could take the laser and align it so that all the light that it's producing goes to the screen. That's one of the many innovations that allowed cinema projectors to be a lot better quality in the last few years than they were in the last few decades. So, because of COVID and the pandemic, we had to pivot that technology because no one was investing in cinema at the time. Cinema hardware is pretty expensive. It's usually a six-figure purchase. You know, $100,000 to $200,000 or $300,000 for a cinema projector. You know, if no one's coming in your door, you're not going to be spending that kind of money or investing that kind of money in your business. You're in survival mode, not expansion mode. So what we did was we innovated because this product wasn't meeting our financial goals. We decided, well, we can make this laser platform do other things. And so what we decided to do was to create a new product in an entirely different industry based on the very same technology platform. And so the cinema projector uses red, green, and blue. We decided, or we discovered, that blue light is especially good at cutting copper and also welding copper metals. And so by taking out the red and the green, we were able to use just the blue light to begin to weld copper. It happened to be at the same time that electric vehicles were becoming more and more popular. And there's a very critical weld that has to happen between your batteries in your electric car and the rest of the system. And that battery joint is joining a copper strip of metal to the anode or the cathode, the plus or the minus of your battery. And so electric vehicles really gave rise to a blue laser specifically designed to cut or weld copper metals. And so just one example of a pivot where the first effort didn't really generate the results because of the pandemic, but taking the same technology and finding a new market for it was a pretty good way to continue to make progress toward our financial goals. So I'll probably go ahead and close just a little bit, but really wanted to end with sort of some key thoughts. What you've seen is that it takes a lot of time to pivot. You have to be innovative, and those are some things that entrepreneurs are constantly doing. But some of you might be asking yourself, how do I become innovative? If you don't see yourself as innovative now, what would you have to do to become innovative? And so I thought I would try to give you some advice a little bit. I'm only a little bit gray-haired, not totally gray-haired, but I've got a few decades on a few of you. But I thought it might be interesting just to say that, always be learning. If you want to learn to be innovative, you have to continue to learn. College is not the end of learning. It's really just the beginning. It takes a lot of keeping yourself open to new knowledge, webinars, watching video cast on YouTube like we are today, trade shows. Anytime you're talking to a customer and doing discovery is a chance to learn. So those are some really good ways to just continue to acquire knowledge. And so that's really a basic requirement for innovation. On top of that, watching for technology trends. This is actually a hard one to do. And you really have to read a lot and study your markets a lot to look for these trends. I wish that the heavens would open and the laser beam would come down and highlight the page and say, oh, that's the new trend. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen too often. But once you start to see multiple articles or multiple news stories on the same technology, you can really begin to sort of spot those trends. Bitcoin. Wish I would have known Bitcoin was going to be a trend. That might have been a good thing to invest in. Those are some good things to watch for. And then tools that save you time. If you can find any tools that automate your day, those are things that are really helpful, because your time is your only resource. Really, you have to have time in the day to be productive, and if you can automate some of that, you really open yourself up for time to be innovative. And then lastly, maybe get up early. Might be a good way to think about, how do I be innovative? Well, I don't know about you guys, but I'm the most creative early in the morning. My wife, she's really creative late at night. So find out what works for you. If you don't get up early, maybe try that. Go for a quick walk and then try to be innovative on top of that. That's just really what's worked for me. So one of the other things I wanted to leave you with was sort of a challenge. You're going to have a different role as entrepreneurs in a couple of years. You're going to have the chance to help other entrepreneurs out, younger entrepreneurs. And that's really was the key to our success, was that our first customer wasn't all that far along in their career path. So J.C. George and Glenn Blunt were the first customers that Mr. Burgess had. And they were only 2 or 3 years out of school. They were both civil engineers working in Jacksonville, and they gave an entrepreneur a chance. He came up with this crazy little electronics package that they had no belief in, but they still gave it a chance. And so they were entrepreneurs themselves. They were civil engineers. They weren't going to school for entrepreneurship, but they saw the opportunity in their field to use this new laser technology to lay sewer pipes. And what they really did was give another entrepreneur a chance. And so I hear some other entrepreneurs in Arkansas talk about how friendly Arkansas is and how everybody in Arkansas is willing to help each other out. So going back even decades, that was true, and it's still true today. So just be watching for that opportunity to pay it forward, if you would, or help another entrepreneur. We continue to do that at Power Technology. We love working with startups. We love building products for other companies, especially technology companies here in the state. We've done that for a number of startups and other companies as well. So the last thing I think I'll talk about is just entrepreneur support organizations. Back in the 60s, there weren't really very many technology companies, and there certainly weren't great organizations like the Conductor, Startup Junkies, and other entrepreneur support organizations. So they're here to help you. It's a real advantage, a real opportunity. If you want to start your own business, they're here to help. And now is the best time to start a business. If you're young, if you fail, you probably haven't lost too much. You might not have a wife, you might not have kids, you might not have a big bank account. It sounds like a good time to risk it and to do something entrepreneurial and try to start something that'll grow over the